Greetings and hello, everyone. So my name is Tiara Thomas, class of 2012 and president of the African American Alumni Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Profiles of Excellence featuring Dr. Joy Bostic. So just as some context, the African American Alumni Association was started in October of 2009. And our purpose is to provide networking and support opportunities for the African American alumni of CWRU. We work to provide a forum for the university to recruit students and foster friendship among persons connected with CWRU. So before we begin today's program, just a few housekeeping things. So first, everyone is muted by default. We ask that you please remain muted to limit background noise during the presentation. We know that some of you have submitted some questions prior to the program, and we hope to get through them throughout the course of the evening. If you have any questions, please utilize the chat feature and we will do our best to get them answered. Two, so that we know who you are, please feel free to rename yourself by clicking on participants, finding your name, and then using the more option to select rename. And you can rename yourself, add your graduation year, your affiliation, whatever you'd like to add there. Finally, please turn on your video if you can. We like to see your smiling faces. So again, I am so happy to welcome you to this installment of Profiles of Inclusive Excellence, a virtual series in collaboration with the African American Alumni Association, the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and the African and African American Studies program to highlight the work and research of African American and Black faculty. Our host for this evening is Dr. Heather Burton. She is Associate Vice President and Senior Director for Faculty and Institutional Diversity with CWRU, specializing in gender and racial equality and equity. She also serves as Acting Co-Director for the African and African American Studies program. I now turn it over to Dr. Burton.
Thank you, Tiara, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm laughing because this is going to be a fun interview. I love when I get faculty who are not only my colleagues at work, but also my friends, but in this case, one of my sorors. And I was laughing, Dr. Bostic, as we prepare to bring you on, because I was thinking, Tiara, I'm no longer acting co-director of the minor.
Okay.
I actually was happy to let that go.
Okay, well, love it.
I was co-director when Dr. Bostic was on sabbatical. And so co-director ended, Joy, you can help me, was it last June? I think it was last June or it was last June.
Yes, 2021.
But I still am actively engaged in the minor program. So this evening, I'm excited because, as I just mentioned, we have Dr. Joy Bostic, who is a colleague of mine here at Case Western Reserve and many of yours, and also I consider a friend, a mentor. We share many conversations to get us through this work, specifically diversity and inclusion work, and she's also one of my sorors. Camille, of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. But so Dr. Bostic, we have kind of when it comes to the Profiles of Excellence, we keep this really informal and conversational because this is a time for us to get to know you differently than we normally get to know our professors on campus. You know, everyone talks about their research. We know about your research, and we're going to touch on that this evening. But we like to get to know who are our Black faculty on campus and just the great contributions that you all have done. And one of the reasons we implemented this was because there are so many Black faculty, I shouldn't say so many, but there are a number of Black faculty on campus that are doing great work. And great work not only at Case Western Reserve, but in the Cleveland community and other places. And so it's become tradition with the Profiles of Excellence to start every interview with the same question. And I think those of you who have been on calls before, you know that I have this infatuation with the movie Brown Sugar. And some of you all can remember Taye Diggs and Sanaa Lathan. And so in that movie, the question was asked, when did you fall in love with hip hop? And so on Profiles of Excellence, what we always ask is, when did you fall in love with your academic discipline? So in other words, Dr. Bostic, to get us started, when did you fall in love with religious studies?
I fell in love with religious studies actually, in the Black church when I was asked to do. It's so funny when you're making me remember things. I was asked to do a women's Bible study, and the scripture, I can't even recall the scripture, but the scripture was problematic for a women's group. Like it was, because when you do scripture, it's very static. There are many things that you can choose. I was like, ooh, this is very violent. And I couldn't figure out how to approach it, because the other thing that when you're in community, you need to come in a particular way where you honor, because this was selected by someone, the women are coming, but I knew that I needed to counter or bring a critique, but I needed to bring it in a way where the community was a part of that process. So I use Black women's poetry, Maya Angelou. I use Sojourner Truth's, one of her speeches. I use Ntozake Shange. And so I came in and I started with Black women's poetry. And then I went to the text. And the Black women, they surprised me in terms of just how the critique that they brought to that engagement, because what the poetry did was it engaged their experience. And so they led with their experience. So by the time I got to the text, I didn't have to do anything. They were like raising questions and saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't connect with my experience. And why is this here? And how does this relate to, this other scripture? And for me, I was struggling with that engagement and what I know about Black religious traditions and my own religious experience. And so the women engage in this very generative, deconstructive, constructive process that helped me to understand how significant engaging in religious studies and Africana cultural traditions is in terms of how we think about, how we bring our worldviews to how we think about ourselves, how we engage community, but also the tensions that people have, and particularly women within these communities, with traditional mainline interpretations, and how hungry they were to find texts and interpretations that actually related to their experiences. And so I walked away from there and I was like, okay, this is how you do it. And this is how we can create change. And this is how we can help people to not only be affirmed and empowered in identity, but also to be equipped to participate in change.
And so what's interesting, and I know, I don't know how many people know this on the call, but you also have a law background.
Mm-hmm.
And so how did you make that shift to decide to come into academia as religious studies versus thinking about going as a law professor?
Well, I've gone to seminary, and I have a theory that a lot of people go to seminary either have considered or married their religious, this is different from religious studies, but this is sort of how I began and I got into religious studies, is through being ordained into ministry or being called into ministry. My theory is that a lot of people either are thinking about medical school or law school. And generally, when someone marries law practice, they're very concerned about social justice and engagement. And so for me, it was thinking about, the law and justice as something that impacted Black people's lives in so many ways and historically. And then as I was engaging in the community in this way, I came to understand that particularly Western particularly Western traditions that are mired in Eurocentrism and white supremacy were so prevalent in terms of how they impacted how people thought about themselves. I began to think, that the law is really important, but for me, because, and as a creative person, I felt like, well, by the time they need the law, they're already in a particular predicament or place. And I felt like religion, not only in terms of deconstructing traditions which were death dealing, but calling upon resources that were healing and empowering and would remedy some of these situations. So I began to understand that religious studies and thinking about culture and aesthetics and art were, and they were so steep, and they were already, these traditions were already so steep within African American traditions and women's traditions. I wanted to think about, well, how do we pull upon this tradition and bring this out in ways that can enable people to view the world differently, to be able to bring critical engagement to traditions that are deeply a part of their lives. And so that's why I made that shift, because, even in terms of just public discourse and engagement, I would hear people and I would see people, and I knew their praxis was different from their interpretations. I remember my pastor in Columbus, Keith Troy, who we knew loved jazz. I mean, the deacons would be out at jazz clubs and would see him. And he was in the pulpit one Sunday, and he said something about, he was naming these sins, and he named you listening to your jazz. And I was like, that's a contradiction, because that wasn't a conflict in our church. But what I understood was that these are part of the tapes that play over and over. So even when you feel like someone has reconciled that is so internalized so deeply around how we think about culture, how cultures have been demonized, how we think about sexuality or don't think about sexuality, aren't able to integrate that, how we think about gender and hierarchy and dichotomies. And so what I understood was this is a lot. We need to do this work. And I felt like I would be so much more effective at that juncture. And I really loved my, the law, my legal education, because I felt like learning to think critically and in terms of how I was trained, has helped me in so many ways and I also got a master's, dual degree, master's in public policy and management. So that time was so critical for me to be able to hone those skills in ways that I think help me as an academic, help me as someone who's engaged in community, and help me in terms of, how I can support people in multiple kinds of ways, even as I'm grounded in religious studies as a way of creating change.
Yeah, and it's you've said a lot that my mind keeps going many places, because it's like questions keep coming, and I was like, okay, I got to remember this question. No, now I'm going to this question. Now I'm shifting. But I'm familiar with Keith Troy because when I was at Ohio State, they had the Watch program, and so as a college student, I used to visit that church. And so hearing certain things you do remember, and like you said, things being ingrained, especially when we're talking about religion and the things that we've learned growing up and how that has shifted. But as I look on your wall behind you, and yes, for colored girls who consider suicide, I also know that you have this creative spirit, you have this creative energy. Dance, photography, textile arts are all a part of who you are. How much do you think your creativity plays into the work that you do, specifically on campus?
I mean, I think it's foundational. And this, by the way, is signed by Trezana Beverly, who was the original woman in Red on the original Broadway production. I worked with her in Harlem in New York City. So she signed this to one of God's colored girls. So I'm always.
And as many meetings as I've been on, I don't think I ever knew that.
I'm telling stories now. But yeah, I mean, a lot of my training, I was in the Chicago area, and of course Columbus, but in New York City, and being in the Black church, I think in general, where you have these confluences, and this is, sort of what I was talking about, even with in New Salem, which is in sort of middle Ohio, which is a little more conservative, but the ways in which I've always been around clergy and pastors and theologians who take very seriously the arts, music, and really draw from all of these sources as a way of thinking creatively and drawing upon images and metaphors. And I think, my recently transitioned advisor, Dolores Williams, was a poet. And she's one of the foundational womanist theologians and a community activist and prominent in the Presbyterian Church. And she used to always say that if we want change and transformation and revolution, we have to rely upon the poets for the language, because you have to come up with new types of language and new ways of thinking about things. So for me, embracing that sense of the artist and the creative helped me to think outside of traditional structures and norms and to really be fluid. One of the things that, so when you fall in love or fall in love again, I mean, I remember being in Harlem and talking to a group of Black women who were engaged in various levels of ministry. And there was a woman who identified as Muslim, and she was using all these different modalities. And we were talking about women who were in the Christian church and were also initiated into Ifa, or other African-based religions. And I asked her, like, well, but because I wanted to sort of hear from them, well, how do you reconcile, sort of identifying a particular tradition and using all these modalities? And I have in my book on African-American female mysticism, she said, honey, I use whatever works. And so this notion of efficacy, which is very deeply ingrained within Black community praxis and connection, that's why I say oftentimes our language will be, will sort of be in contradiction to actually how, we act and how we actually engage in relationships, because we haven't necessarily, broken through sort of how you articulate a theology or religious worldview that is actually consistent with, how you actually move in the world. And I think being an artist, because you're creating out a particular impulse, is in many ways you transcend or you move beyond those kinds of boxes, and you're able to think and create in that moment in ways that, and then you come back and you sort of work through how you're generating the language, or they come out simultaneously. So I think for me, especially dancing, because that, my first one of my teachers, Joan Peters just passed too. I used to take Ailey classes, and she would, from straight out of Fame, she'd have her stick and she would take time. And it just was one of those ways in which I learned how, because in academia, you can often be in your head. And I learned how important it was for you to really be able to do cutting edge work and be creative, is you have to be able to integrate the body. And also that helps us with being, with empathy and compassion and how we're connecting with the folks who are part of our work, and for whom our work ought to make sense.
And I'm listening to you when you talked about your dance instructor and Fame, and immediately I thought of Irene Cara, but I also thought of Debbie Allen's famous line, "You want fame? Well, fame costs." And right here is where you start paying in sweat.
Yeah.
And so in that, though, it brought me to the fact that I share this with you, is that in seminary, one of the faculty recommended your book to me as I was working on an African-American female mysticism. And they were like, "This is such a great book. You should check this out." And it's by Dr. Joy Bostic. And I said, well, look at that. I said, well, I actually know Dr. Bostic. But in that, One of the things that I noticed in that book and also just in your work in general is that you don't have a problem with stepping outside of the expectation, stepping outside of the norm of what should be done. What gives you the strength to do that?
Ooh, okay. Well,
you didn't know I was coming with that
one. I mean, I come from a particular kind of stock, I've been thinking about this particular issue. My mom transitioned earlier, my father transitioned in 2010. And I think about, and even going home and my siblings and, sort of my uncles and cousins and sort of all these conversations. And, I come from my grandmother and who was a musician I actually don't have any choice but to be honest and tell the truth as I understand it. Like there isn't anything in me that if I attempt to try to kind of come back, it just doesn't work out for me very well. So I and I had that example. I mean, I think about, my mother and my aunts and my grandmother and my father. My father was very cool and cerebral. My mom was very fun loving, but they were very like cut to the chase and would say what needed to be said in that moment. And so that's so basic to who I am. Mm-hmm. And yes, there have been times you pay the price, and I don't know if it's paying a price, because one of the things, again, I come from a family that this is just what we do. And the humility that I've learned in the family, it's like, I don't even know if there's a price, because there are things that I don't seek, and I just learned that from my family. I remember being in a conversation and I didn't actually get what was going on with a group of white women who were trying to ask me, like, who were my mentors? And I think for them, they wanted to sort of find out, this is a community group, sort of what white teachers or what sort of white, faculty I was looking at. And I said, this is what my family does. This is our conversations across the dinner table. This is driving the car with my father, observations. And so, and not seeking, for the need for particular kinds of approval or, advancement, et cetera, has I come back home and I'm not concerned if I'm not invited to whatever the end thing is, for the people who know. I'm like, okay, I'm home. and I'll put on my footies and I'm good. And so, not that it doesn't, there aren't ways in which that bothers me, but I think, even here, and particularly the way that I work, because I work, I do a lot of things that are public, but I work in ways that are very strategic and one-on-one, et cetera. And so sometimes it does, sort of, especially and Heather, we have those sister conversations. I've had that everywhere I've worked, where, even working in Harlem, where someone comes in the office and you're like, okay, come sit down, let me close the door. Because by the look on their face, they just need to vent and debrief. And so what's happening now here, even at the university, is people recognizing that, and you realize it is important, for people to recognize and acknowledge the work that you're doing. But for the most part, you just move through and you just do the work. And when you see it change, or when you see people like aha moments, or when students email me, I've had students who gave me a hard time in the class, disagree with everything that I said. I got an email. I taught Black film, and I'm teaching, these larger, sort of constructs, and I had a student who just disagreed with me vehemently and sent me an email 2 years ago and said, Dr. Bostic, now that I'm out here, I understand everything that you said, and you were right. And, those kind of moments, and I don't, when you recognize that you're having an impact, for me, that's the most important thing to me, is to see people run with, even colonels, And so for you to tell me that someone mentioned my book, that feels good, but I don't, but I haven't thought about it. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's good. Somebody is checking it out.
Somebody's reading it. Yeah.
So,
And I think about just when we got on this call before we even started the interview, how Tiara Thomas, congratulations to our new president of African American Alumni Association. But one of the first things that she said to you was that you were one of her favorite professors here on campus. And I think hearing that, seeing that, it allows us to see the impact that you've had, not only just with students, but in the work. And one example is your recent position change into the dark side of administration. And so, seeing that and seeing what you do, seeing the care that you've taken with the minor. But what has been most enjoyable? And I won't ask the question in terms of faculty versus administration. We won't do one of those questions, but just because we know administration has its challenges, just as being a faculty does. But what has been most enjoyable for you?
I mean, I think there are two sides of that. For me, being able to, in terms of the academic and administrative side, for me, it's like being able to use all the tools in my toolbox. Like, I love being able to, my goal, and I think what I want to do in terms of how I'm mentoring other people, is how do you fully integrate who you are in the world? Because, academia, everyone, we're oftentimes in these disciplines. And so there are ways in which, and people may ask us to, or we're always trying to figure that out because we don't always have models for how to do that. And so for me, it's just, I have so much fun just being able to move in different ways and respond. I think for me, I was actually just saying this because we just came back from the American Academy of Religion is our professional guild, and we always have our annual meeting the weekend before Thanksgiving. And I think I presided over one session and was chair over another. And you know how I don't know, but what happens is, especially when you I was responded, you don't get people's papers. And if you get their paper, they may, their presentation may leave out things that you put in your response. And so I did one, and it was, it was religion, but it was all different subfields that I really, haven't been a part of. And what I realized is that all of the experiences that I've had enabled me to get up and really respond in that moment, not only as an academic, but as a Baptist preacher and as, an administrator, and so I really have a lot of fun, pulling all of that together and just being able to, and I was in the room and, I hadn't been in a meeting in a long time, and I was moving around the room, and I was, I always make these jokes about being a Baptist preacher. And I had two men who came up to me and said, yeah, we're preachers too. It's and we know how having that podium in between you, and the people can be so difficult. And so I just celebrate the fact that I'm free and, at this point to just be all of that. And I think what I've been able to do at this point in my career at CWRU is to be all of that. And what I want to do through Hills, through mentoring, through my teaching, is enable students and my colleagues and people in the community to be all of that. There's so many ways in which, we come into institutional engagements, be it religious institutions, community, family structured, et cetera, and people, kind of want to shut down different parts of yourselves, or they want you to, shrink back in some ways. And,
right.
What would it mean if we all could show up just all of it, and just And of course, I know that, you're engaged with others, so you're always responding. And so I know, so when I say show up with all of it, I don't mean, just on blast. I mean, being able to engage freely in terms of what's needed in that moment, because we're always engaging other people. We're not stepping over other people or shouting over people. But what does it mean to actually be able to bring all of who you are in ways that you can respond in that moment to what other people are giving out or what's needed? And I think that's what healing is about. That's what, creating the praxis for remedy is about. It's going back to, the sister's words, being able to do what works, and in ways that people can receive it and hear it. And they may not be able to in that moment, but again, you find people kind of circle back and let you know. But it's also a way of modeling, because what I also understand is I'm modeling for other people, what it really means to be empowered and to be free. And it's, and I recognize, like anybody else, I'm not always showing up, and I have my tea because I'm really tired right now. So I realize what I need to adjust and to show up sometimes. And this year I'm really learning how to integrate that more deeply so that I can, continue to support other people in that. But yeah.
Yeah, and I know we were together yesterday and talking about just how it felt like Friday on yesterday, and that we needed to start over. And so anyone on the call that wants to join my bandwagon, that I believe that after Thanksgiving we should shut down as an institution and not come back to January. I may have a petition soon. It probably won't go nowhere with my office, but it just in that. If you have questions for Dr. Bostic, please put those in the chat. We will take questions from the chat and from our audience. So if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat. And as we continue our conversation, Dr. Bostic, one of the things that I want to ask also is, when you think about your childhood, what impact did your childhood and growing up have on who you are today? How did that influence your decisions? And especially, I know you mentioned briefly about, your mom and your dad, and how it was just natural for you to be strong, for you to walk in everything that you do. But what else about your childhood had an impact on who you are today?
Well, so many things. Certainly the church. I grew up in a church where my uncle by marriage was the pastor. My great aunt was the first lady. My grandmother was a choir director and church musician. My aunts all, were trained as musicians. They all were in the choir. But, as many people grow up in a Black church, I mean, that was where you learned public speaking and you engaged in public speaking. And when you start that way in Sunday school in a Black church, you're so fully affirmed. You can get up, and sing, you can be off key, you can do whatever. But if you are prepared and you are making your best effort, there are people, go ahead, baby. Yes, go ahead. You did that. And they're applauding you, and you're just so affirmed, and you're just, you're in your Sunday best, and, you're picking out your outfits. And, it's like, and what I'm writing now is like the ways in which, just not sort of music and ritual, but adornment and fashion, like all of those things, those embodied parts of who we were just a part of an entire, picture. And the hats and the women in the, in the church, and the hats and the suits and the deacons, lining hymns. And, so all of that was just part of the mood and the grace that was a part of that community. It's just something I learned. So even if you were in disagreement, I just experienced such a level of grace in the Black church, where when you were together in community, you treated each other in a particular way. If you disagreed, if you had different belief systems, you engage people in a level of respect and inclusion, where no one was pushed out. They were included. And so, not that there weren't problems, certainly theological, et cetera, but I just learned that. And then as I grew up in the church and I began to question things, particularly along, the dichotomies and social identities and et cetera, I was always in a place where I could make that next step. But as a child, and then I grew up, I have friends, and we were all first generation folks.
Mm-hmm.
But it was never a question that we were going to college.
Right.
But, it's we talked about this today. It's like I still don't know how that actually happened. I mean, I kind of had, more of a step up because my aunts, the youngest, my mom was one of 9 siblings. The two youngest, because how young they were in that age where they actually went to college. My father did maybe a year, and then I came along, he had to go get a job. But mostly all my friends I went to school with and grew up with, and we were in dance teams together and Afro-American club and we that's the other thing. I mean, I was secretary, in my Sunday school. I was part of the NAACP youth. So there are just so many community organizations and that we were just a part of. And, my parents went to Central High, which wasn't segregated at the time, but most of the Black folks went to Central because of the geographical demographics, and so they all knew each other, and so when we grew up, we all of their parents knew our parents, and so there was just this kind of community connection where people knew you and they saw you and you knew you were being seen, so you couldn't run around, anonymously engaging in particular kind of behavior. And so, yeah, I always just knew, I always wanted, I don't know if I consciously or it wasn't an oppressive thing or whatever, but I saw, everybody in my family were hardworking. Education was key and important. I never felt like I didn't have a voice or I couldn't engage, in conversations. My father would, we'd be driving to the city and he'd be talking about, just certain issues. And I just was we were just always a part of those kind of conversations. And so that's how I grew up.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And really just thinking about that. And as you were talking about, just growing up in the Black church, I know myself and VP Solomon, we always make the comment that everything that you learned about being a church chief diversity officer, you learned in the Black church.
Ooh. Okay, let me tell you one story. So this is when I was in Harlem, and I wanted to do something in terms of women's ministry. So my first thought, the first thing you do in a Black church is, the pastor needs to approve it. But I knew if the pastor disapproved it, because I was associate minister, youth minister, I wouldn't have any other recourse. It was shut down in his office. Mm-hmm. So I was actually walking up the aisle, and one of the director of education, one of the mothers of church, been there longer than the pastor's been there through 3 or 4 pastors. So I grabbed her. She said, Reverend Bostic, how you doing? So I said, I'm doing all right. I have an idea about, and I can't remember what specific, but it was something in women's ministry. She said, I think that's a great idea. I think that's actually perfect. We need to go to, the pastor about this. And the pastor was walking down the aisle. She stood up, grabbed, said, Reverend Davis, Reverend Bostic has this great idea, and I think we ought to do it. And what I understood is, this is how you sort of think about power dynamics and stakeholders. And what I understood, if she said we were going to do it, there wasn't any way for him to. If I'd have gone to his office, he could have told me no. But because of the power dynamics, the hierarchy, I couldn't have gone around him. Mm-hmm. And they would have been, and she would have been in a difficult position to do that once I'd gone around him. Mm-hmm. I took her under, I was like under advisement, and I didn't even know she was going to do that, but she decided we needed to do it. And so once you begin to understand who the players are and how the dynamics actually work, even with those kind of hierarchical patterns, you know in the Black church who has the power, and those Black women know how, and and that wasn't unintentional the way she did that. Mm-hmm. So I learned from them. That's right. I did a master's in public policy management at Ohio State, But I learned how to navigate power dynamics from these Black women in the church. Because even though they were under these sort of dynamics of hierarchy and they may have sort of talked about submission and headship around women, but if they wanted to, but they knew how to make things happen and do the things that needed to be done. And so I learned from the best, because those women knew how to get it done.
Yeah, and that, we always talk about that, and that's a great example. And it also goes to how you navigate the space in which we work, and understanding the power dynamics and how to get it done. I always say we know how to have many backdoor conversations to get the work done so that we can get through the power dynamics and especially in this work. Mm-hmm. Remember, if you have any questions, please put those questions in the chat. We will take questions from the audience. Mm-hmm. When you think about your research, what are you working on now?
Right now, I'm recognizing this is kind of a culmination of the work that I've done. When I was in my PhD program, actually one of my exams was on what I call the choreo sermon, which was taken from Ntozake Shange's notion of a choreo poem. And so it's a coming together of sort of all these various aesthetic dimensions and looking at ritual and Africana religion and popular culture. And so what I'm recognizing is that the ways in which we don't have ritual structures that have been part of traditional Africana traditions. And so I just began to think about popular music, and particularly a person like Beyonce. So many of you may know, as I started doing these popular culture courses, when Beyonce's Lemonade album came out and Prince died like that same weekend. Mm-hmm. And then Kendrick Lamar's Damn came out, and I did a course on that, and that filled up like 50 students overnight. And then Black Panther came out, and I did Afrofuturism, because I was trying to sort of figure out, what is so powerful about, these cultural productions, and why are they important? And so I started by looking at the religious dimensions that were a part of them, and particularly when you look at Lemonade, because she's collaborating with so many artists who actually are practitioners or come out of these different traditions. And so one of my goals is always sort of connections. And so one of the things that I'm also trying to unpack is the anti-Blackness and anti-Africanness that's been a part of Western Christianity, but also how Black people have internalized. I remember the first time I taught Black religion, or I'm not sure, African-American religions, and I always start with Vodou. And so I'm always talking to my students, and I'm talking to them about what kinds of things, practices, do people do in your family? And they're like, well, that's just superstitions. And or they'll think of something. I said, but that's not Christian, right? And they don't know because they don't know where it comes from. And so my goal is to sort of say, yeah, these practices, or at least these sensibilities, come from somewhere. And what I'm trying to do is to reverse that kind of anti-Blackness and anti-Africanness that we've internalized, because it's not only a part of Black family and Black culture, but it's a part of Western culture and American culture. Black music is so foundational, and Black music carries those cosmologies of Africana religions with them, those rituals. And so even in their appropriation, which of course, is problematic, this American culture, is being influenced by these very, these Africana systems and worldviews. And so what I'm looking at, what I've come to understand I'm looking at in terms of looking at these popular cultures, is a way in which, or at least the question of, are people gravitating toward this, particular African-American people gravitating toward this as a stand-in for the kind of rituals that we don't have? And particularly within the Christian tradition, even though compared to other ethnic expressions of Christianity, it's deeply more embodied. But there's still this divide in terms of how we actually think about our full embodiment as sexual, embodied physical human beings in the world and how we think about that in terms of our spirituality. And so one of my pieces is, how is that structured within various kinds of music? And what does it mean for people to participate in, public performances? And now sort of with Renaissance coming out, which came out in a very different way, where we don't have any images from Beyonce. But the community has really taken that up. And, there are clubs where they play Renaissance front to back, back to front. I mean, just continuous,
Mm-hmm.
post-COVID. And there's a way in which these ritual structures that came out of the hush harbors, what we call the hush harbors in African, and ring shouts, which are part of the shouting traditions within Black churches. Those rings, the jam session, the cipher, the hip hop cipher, all of those for me are similar types of ritual movements that we gravitate toward as a way of empowerment and healing. And so I'm looking at, like, how do we actually, and I'm leading toward questions, how do we structure that in community in ways where we're actually intentional about building structures of healing and empowerment? Because we still, even though we have movement in the Black church, we still don't have deep ways of thinking about developmentally, whereas Africana and on the African traditional continental, there are ways in which ritual and initiations move people through developmentally, from puberty,
right,
to partnering, or to initiation, where they might be celibate. There are just many ways in which people would be initiated, or there were structures and ongoing structures. That's what, the Black Panther, Black Panther Wakanda Forever is a high example of the ways in which Kugler, coming out of Oakland, is so deeply steeped in communal recognitions. Because I know in Harlem it's like this. I know it's like this in Oakland. If someone transitions, they die, or there's celebrations, those are being marked communally. And New Orleans is another place where people come out in the streets or in parks,
mm-hmm.
and they're coming together. And so Kugler understood that he couldn't replace Chadwick Boseman, that the community needed to mourn who he as a person meant to us. And he did that beautifully within the film. I mean, he did that also for the people who were part of the production, the actors. I understood they went to Chadwick Boseman's gravesite, et cetera, et cetera. But I was in there with G-Cuff, Cleveland, G-Cuff, Cleveland Greater Urban.
Cleveland Urban.
Yeah. So it's late. It's my bedtime
Urban Film Festival.
And so I was there with Black folks who were responding to that. And that needed to happen because of all the trauma and all the loss that we're always dealing with. Mm-hmm. And so for Kugler to understand that as an artist and use that platform, so that's what I'm thinking about. How does this actually happening in many ways? And what does it say in terms of the kinds of things we need to actually, draw upon, so people do have ways of moving through developmentally how they think about who they are, as whole beings, and how they can contribute.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And just thinking of all your facets and your facets of your brain, and in every direction that it goes, even with your research and the work that you do, and just the engagement and community engagement with students, and really looking at how you deal with the Black community and educating and teaching. And we see it on our campus on a regular basis. And so with that, when you think about how much you give, and you give a lot. You give a lot through community work, you give a lot through religious studies, you give a lot through your administration job, you give a lot to your family. In that, what are some things that you enjoy? What is it that Dr. Bostic likes to do?
Look, I want to take you to my kitchen. Like, I just got a new range that is deep red. I've been looking at it for a couple of years. So
I'll joke really quickly. So I was at Dr. Bostic's house, and I had to eat vegan cookies. So I have my share of vegan cookies because you're going to do vegan if you hang out with Dr. Bostic. Now, I don't do eggs and dairy, but I eat meat, so I laugh all the time. But she is the chef of vegan dietary needs. But you got your new range now?
I do. So I, because I want to bake, and my other oven was just uneven, so I got a convection oven now. So, but and I have my tagine pots, and so I love to cook. I love, when the onions and the garlic get in that oil and you smell it, and I dance. And in fact, one of my favorite cookbooks is from Bryant Terry, who's from Oakland, and he actually, when he gives you a recipe, he has music and works of art, that he cites in terms of how he talks about different dishes. So I love his recipes, and he started me like really like playing a particular song and dancing. So I always feel like my food tastes better when I'm dancing in the kitchen. But yeah, I love dancing. I love cooking. I love gardening. And I love walking. One of the things I love about my neighborhood, I'm in Larchmere neighborhood. So, being in Cleveland and taking advantage of, all the restaurants, but also we have up at Shaker Square, the market, but also right over here on the other side is Dome Creek, and, walking out to Shaker Lake, and it's almost like hiking, and you can go in and you see deer. I saw a coyote one time. Luckily, he was on the other side of the stream. But yeah, and film. I mean, when I first moved here and came to Shaker Square, I didn't have any furniture. I didn't have any TV, and I just felt so isolated. My father said, "Go buy a chair." So I went around. I love antiquing. That's another thing that you can do in this neighborhood. And I bought a chair from somebody, but I would go to Shaker Square Cleveland Cinemas. And that's when Born Identity, I think, and Harry Potter were out. So I love film. I love the Cleveland Museum of Art. And when I'm on campus, a lot of times I'll take a break and walk around the lagoon, but just also go and meditate and sit on a bench and meditate on the art. So that's one of the things I love. I kind of gleaned from being in the Chicago area and New York City, but anywhere I go now, the food scene, art, performance. Just went to see Chaka Khan. So it's really that kind of, just being engaged in creativity, I think, which, feeds back into my scholarship, and just making those connections in the brain, I think.
So what's your favorite dish to cook?
My favorite dish, well, I've gotten into soca bread, which is, but my favorite dish, I think I always have to name more than one. So I make really good collard greens, vegan, non-vegan, or otherwise, because I always have tasters who are not vegan. So Lauren, who's our departmental assistant, she's a foodie, so she has a very sophisticated palate. So I always have her taste things to say, because when I have people come to my home, I want them to feel nurtured by the food, and I don't want them to be thinking about, whether or not they have meat. And then when my mom was here, her caregivers, they would be taste. So I always had people who would taste stuff. But I think probably I have a curry mustard green stew. And then I have a sweet potato, lima bean tagine. And I do a good peanut stew. I'm going to play with that a little bit more because I got another recipe on that. Those are the things that come to mind. But I just, I love cooking, and I love flavors, and there's not a vegetable I don't like. So I just love exploring food.
Yeah, I saw Dedra's face light up with some of the dishes. as you were talking. So our time is winding down. And of course, I have tons of questions that I would love to ask, but our time is winding down. Do you have anything that I have not asked that you want to share with the audience? Someone did say that they regret they have to leave because of another commitment, but your discussion brings to mind the shouting rituals that took place when they grew up in the Southern Black Baptist Church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the shouting rituals, which come out of, again, the ring shouts, which again were movement. And if you know anything about sort of Hush Harbors and the ring shouts, the compromise that Black people made in that sense was the still this dichotomy between the sacred and the profane or the mundane. And so they had to create a ritual where the dance and even the movement would be considered separate from the profane, according to sort of westernized Christianity. And so the compromise they made is that the movement around the ring shout, you didn't cross your feet, and so they kept their feet on the ground, but they added layers. They didn't have instrumentations. A lot of that was denied them, so they used their bodies and hand claps. And so, but again, it was sort of the multiplicity of the rhythmic structure, the shifting in of leadership, where again, that was never, one person had to lead. It would shift according to the movement, the improvisational ways in which they could create and recreate lyrics, again, depending upon what was going on in the community. They had basic structures that were common and understood. And so the movement itself, became the cycle that elevated and transported folks and transformed folks within that space. And so the shout, and they called that running spirituals, and the spirituals in terms of those musical forms came out of that. And so the movement in Black churches was taken up by the organ and the drums, because there's a particular kind of music that you play when you sort of moved into that shout movement. In fact, sometimes preachers have to tell the musicians to stop, because they'll think they're getting a moment in the sermon where they can start to shout, and he's like, no, I'm not there yet. You have to hold up.
Right. Hold off. I'm ready.
But that's what I'm saying. I see that in popular music forms. I see that with musicians. I see that with the ways in which, people are being elevated and transported in that moment. And I want to sort of figure out how we draw from that. But those traditions within the Black church, because essentially in Africana traditions, in Black traditions, there really isn't that separation is not natural between the sacred and the profane. It's not natural because all of it is seen within this cosmology of connection, not just with the living, but with the dead, with the spirits. It's like everyone is part of this visible and invisible world. And so that those ritual spaces are the way that we connect with each other, but fully and wholly with ourselves, and are able to express it. And so the problem that we continue to have to try to come out of is that sense that there's something separate,
right,
between you and me, between myself, and the different parts of who I am, where I have to be this way here and I have to be this way there. And so the shout is the release, of all of that suppression, and or the recognition of how deeply and profoundly we are connected. And so the shout, is always moving us through the various ways in which we are always, as Black people in particular, dealing with the trauma of our history and the joy of how we show up in and through it day by day. And so I know you asked one of the questions, I think, in leading is, sort of what becomes difficult. And then sometimes the trauma, of what people are going through that we're studying or engaging is difficult. But I tell you, I see this in my own family, the joy and the humor and the creativity and the love that continues to be consistent and show up, in all and through of this, lets me know how human I am and how deeply human we all are. And, you just keep doing what you do and you keep loving.
And I think that is a great note to actually end on, is the joy, love, and the human, and how human we all are, and in sharing that commonality. And so, Dr. Bostic, we thank you for taking time, even though you are a co-sponsor of the African Studies minor, a co-sponsor, but we thank the African and African American Study Minors Program. We also thank the African and African American Alumni Association, or the African American Alumni Association, also the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. And more importantly, we thank Dr. Bostic, we thank Tiara and Katie and Sarah for your dedication to allow this programming to happen. We do have our Profiles of Excellence coming up on December 8th. And so we ask you to join for December 8th with, I think Katie can help me out, but I think on December 8th, I'm looking at the calendar, Katie, I think December 8th, we have Mark Joseph joining us on December 8th. So Mark Joseph will join us on December 8th. And we're excited because this year, Katie, what do we have? We have everyone scheduled. So we actually have everyone scheduled for the entire academic year. So we move forward. So look for those advertisements. Again, Dr. Bostic, thank you.